to you and welcome to this new episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. My name is Caitlin and I'll be your hostess. I have 20 plus years experience in sewing and then over 14 years experience in living history as a hobby. And this podcast is going to explore my adventures within living history, creating wardrobes, studying the past, all that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that, I would love it if you consider following along by subscribing. Last time I gave you an overview about how I got started into living history, and also we discussed homespun fabrics of the 19th century and my newest adventures into attempting to replicate homespun cloth. And this time we're going to an in-depth look into 19th century dressmakers and how they worked and performed their craft. There seems to be a lot of misconceptions about dressmaking as a whole, and so I want to clear some of those up today. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the time period of 1840 to 1870. I hope this to be very informative to folks because I don't see a lot of people posting information about 19th century dressmakers, and I think there's, again, a lot of misconceptions, so I'm hoping to clear those up and also to add a little bit to the current worldview of how things worked in the past and how women made their professions. So without further ado, let's get started. Also, if you're viewing this video and not just listening, I know my eye is super swollen. My sister and I decided we're going to make wine this year with a bunch of wild grapes that go around the county. I picked grapes for years. We make jelly all the time. This particular batch that I got into 2 days ago, and there's a cat, apparently I'm allergic to something that the vines were growing on. And so my entire arm is very, very swollen. You can see how red and bumpy it is. And then apparently I got something in my eye as well. So if you're listening to it, it won't be a big deal to you. If you're viewing, yes, I'm aware it looks bad. I'm taking Benadryl and it's gone, the swelling's gone down. But yeah, it's the things I do for knowledge. I don't even drink wine. I don't drink at all, but I wanted to learn how, so we're making 2 batches of wine. So dressmaking was a very common profession for women in earlier years. It was seen as a woman's profession. It was an easy way for women to earn a modest income should the need arise. Dressmaking, in an essence, is someone who makes dresses. So dressmaking as a profession differs slightly from the profession of seamstress, who may take on any number of sewing work, including things like men's shirts. Dressmakers typically only make dresses. Dressmaking is a form of skilled labor that, even though it wasn't always seen as skilled labor, it was also easy in the terms that most women back in the day could sew in the Victorian era, or at least they could hold a needle and stitch 2 pieces of fabric together. So dressmakers were a dime a dozen and not always valued at their trade. There are, however, many instances of distinguishing good dressmakers from the bad. Quite frequently in period works, you'll hear the lament of want of a good dressmaker and how difficult it is to find one. We'll discuss a story later on with a particularly bad dressmaker, but for now I'll just discuss another period reference to the art of dressmaking as a profession. The Employments of Women, a Cyclopedia of Women's Work, which was published in 1863 by Virginia Penny, is a wonderful read about all the work that a woman could take on in the 1860s, since most of the men were off fighting in the Civil War. And somebody had to bring not only an income in, but also maintain the community with skills and trades. And she has a bit on dressmakers, what they've earned and how they came to be their profession. So we will be referencing this book quite a bit in today's episode. Starting with what Mrs. Penny has to say about dressmaking in general, I quote, "There is probably no occupation in which there are so many incompetent persons as that of dressmaking. Many persons take it up without having learned the trade at all, and many who become reduced in circumstances immediately resort to it without any preparation and are destitute not only of experience, but of skill, ingenuity, and taste." End quote. Time and time again, when families fell on hard times, a common first step was for the woman in the family to take on work, often through sewing, shirts, or dressmaking. Laundry would be another way that women could earn money, but that was physically laborious work. And that is not to say that dressmaking is an easy profession. It is, in fact, not. One must spend very, very long hours hunched over, sewing by candlelight, dealing with clients who often have very high expectations that are physically impossible, but are very demanding. And the list goes on. Dressmaking is more or less in this time a seasonal profession. They would be swamped with work in the spring and the fall when the new fashions came out, but in the in-between, their work could be very sparse, and therefore their income would be very sparse. The Dressmaker and Milliner, published in 1843, has this to say about the plight of a dressmaker. quote, "Among the disadvantages of the business of a dressmaker are poor gains on one hand and very hard work on the other. If the dressmaker succeeds particularly well, she is liable to be overdone with work, and if she does not succeed well, she is in danger of being pinched with poverty. Her work, too, is not certain and regular. At particular times of the year, she is hurried and fatigued, while at others she has little or nothing to do." End quote. So not only is the work stressful and the money somewhat poor, but your clientele may be very difficult to work with. I myself have worked with clients wishing their gowns to fit like a painting, which is never possible with a moving body. A dress may fit perfectly well when standing, but when you sit there may be a small wrinkle or two just due to how the body conducts itself, and clients are not always aware of the limitations within dressmaking, and that can be very difficult to explain without sounding like you don't know what you're talking about as the dressmaker. So who is taking on this very difficult profession by which to earn their living? Let's explore who are the dressmakers and how one becomes a dressmaker. Firstly, dressmakers are typically women, although not always. As to how they learn their craft, there are various avenues. Dressmaking as a craft did not have a curriculum, a diploma, certificate, or anything of that sort. Any woman who found herself wanting of cash could theoretically call herself a seamstress or a dressmaker and begin working. You may not be long in business if you are poor at the needle, but you could call yourself a dressmaker and take on work. Dressmaking was also an apprenticed profession, meaning that it was common for young women who knew their life's vocation was going to be dressmaking to apprentice themselves to a higher and more experienced madam dressmaker for some years to learn the craft. If one was a dressmaker's apprentice, they did not always learn the fitting or the pattern making, but often just the sewing unless there was a special contract drawn up that specified that the hopeful young dressmaker was to learn things such as fitting and pattern making. If you only learned the sewing portion and not the pattern making, it would be nearly impossible to start up your own practice, but instead you could be employed under another dressmaker after your apprenticeship and then again only do the sewing portion. The dressmaker and the milliner in 1843 referenced before, and I quote, "Most girls began dressmaking very early, that is to say when they clothed their dolls. This is all practice in dressmaking. If you have had a mother or a schoolmistress who let you dress a doll and made you do it neatly, you have had a good an introduction to your future business as you could desire. From making your doll's frocks, your next step was probably to make your own." End quote. The same source does also state that when speaking of apprenticeships, quote, "There have been many instances of girls becoming good dressmakers without having served an apprenticeship to the business, but such girls have been an uncommon sort," end quote. According to The Unprotected, or Facts in Dressmaking Life, published in 1857, some establishments in England were taking apprentices at age 13 or 15 up to about age 25 or 27. The hours an apprentice would work would vary. Establishments were asked in England to keep to 12 hours a day on their slack season and 13 and a half hours during their busy season. Still, some establishments were making their dressmakers work from 8 in the morning until 2 in the morning, or even longer, up to 4 in the morning. Some of the mistresses or madams of the larger dressmaking establishments in the same book mentioned that the long hours are often attributed to clients who wait to the last minute to order a dress and insist upon it being done right away. The employments of women, referenced before, also states that in some schools, such as New York's Wilson's Industrial School, and yes, there is a cat at my feet. Yes, you can hear him. He will probably be meowing. I'm sorry if that bothers you. I can't shut him up. He's just here to get attention. Anyway, New York's Wilson's Industrial School taught older girls dressmaking as a way to earn a living. After graduating, either from the apprenticeship or at a school, a dressmaker may begin her own business or become employed underneath another dressmaker as an assistant. A dressmaker with her own business could live on her own if she could afford it, or live with her family if needed. We'll touch a bit more on the services that dressmakers provide in a moment in the next section. Most dressmakers were unmarried or widowed. I very rarely come across married dressmakers working full-time. Most of the married women who are taking on sewing work were middle to upper working class women who just needed a little bit more to make ends meet or to earn a little bit of their personal spending money. In fact, Louisa May Alcott's of Little Women's fame, her sister Anna Alcott Pratt, who is married, mentions in her diary that she bought a sewing machine to take in sewing work on the side. She mentions once or twice that she actually very much dislikes sewing, but it's a way to earn money to purchase clothing articles for herself, including a bonnet. Mrs. Pratt on April 25th, 1861 says, and I quote, "I've engaged to sew a day or two for Molly, and to make a dress for Lucy, and shall earn myself a bonnet. There's a great deal of pleasure in earning one's own things." End quote. I don't believe Mrs. Pratt would classify herself as a seamstress or dressmaker by profession, but she does use her skills to earn herself a wardrobe that would otherwise not be affordable, as her husband only makes $500 a year, which is a comfortable living for upper working class, by the way. That's not destitute poor, but she calls herself poor, but it's not struggling on the streets poor, if that makes sense. Another example of a woman taking on sewing is in 1847's Godey's Ladies Book. There is a story called Lydia Leeson, A Story of a Silk Dress. It's the personal favorite story of mine. We'll be referencing this story quite a bit, but some 3 pages into the story, Lydia's widower uncle comes to the family and tells her, quote, "I'm glad to find you have some taste in books. An illiterate woman is my aversion, but at the same time I hope you are not too bookish. Can you make a shirt or a pudding?" Lydia says that yes, she can make both a shirt and a pudding, and her mother informs Uncle Kennedy that the pudding that he had praised so highly earlier was entirely Lydia's doing. And apparently her good pudding served Lydia to distinguish her skills, as her uncle then commissions her to make a set of shirts and that he will pay her $25 to do it. It is never specified how many shirts Lydia makes for Uncle Kennedy, but I would venture to assume that it was at least half a dozen shirts, as shirts were often, like chemises and drawers and nightdresses, mentioned in dozens or half dozens. The story is written in the format of a diary, with Lydia writing to her married sister Margaret, and the entries are typically addressed to Margaret. After accepting her uncle's proposal, Lydia writes to Margaret, quote, "And then there is nothing to be ashamed of in making linen for one's uncle, even if I am compensated for it. It does not a seamstress make me. And what if it did? Where is the disgrace in being a seamstress, even if all of Hazelridge knew it? I may be compelled at some time or other really to get my living by the needle. Away with false pride, have I not been taught to despise it? I wish I were as good as I ought to be. Then I should not have such a foolish craving for a silk dress." End quote. You see, it's only page 3, and we have already several times over been made aware of Lydia's intense desire for a silk dress to match all the ladies in town. Lydia's father was the town doctor, but the community was generally healthy, and patients were far and few between. The only regular work was 4 dyspeptic gentlemen and 3 nervous ladies. And I'll just mention here, because it's funny, one of those ladies is mentioned on page 1. She is the newly widowed Tremblay, and how I love the apt names for characters in Victorian stories. I think it just cracks me up. Anyway, Mrs. Tremblay recently dyed her mourning dress, mourning without a U, so mourning as in the time of day. And she's been holding her infant against this black mourning dress, and she notices that the child's arm has turned black, and she assumes that the infant's arm was mortified. And she calls the doctor, and she assumed that he was going to have to cut it off. And nope, it was just the dye cracking off from her black cotton mourning dress. And she called and paid a doctor just for him to tell her to put soap and water on the baby's arm. So Dr. Leeson, although a professional man, was not earning a great living and could not afford a silk dress for Lydia, who was 16 at the time. So when the opportunity arose to earn her own silk dress, she did. But see how in the earlier quote how Lydia accepts that she's compensated for work, but that does not a seamstress make her. Taking commissioned work was not seen as a profession unless you took it on regularly, but women at all stages of life could earn some pocket money if they were just willing to take on some sewing work in their spare time. We will revisit Lydia's story later and see what becomes of the desired silk dress. I also want to briefly touch on, although the vast majority of dressmakers were women, again, there are some male dressmakers, most notably in France, but this is very rare, and we will talk about more about them in a moment. For now, let's touch on what services did dressmakers provide and how do they work. The dressmaker in the milliner in 1843, referenced before, says, and I quote, "There are, as you know, several kinds of dressmakers. Some are at the head of large and showy establishments in London and other large towns. Some have humbler establishments, a single room perhaps, with 2 or 3 workwomen. Many live with their families or quite alone and go out to work by the day in ladies' houses, and many living alone take in work to be done at home." End quote. So yes, there are many places a dressmaker could work. If she lived in a large city, she could own or work at a very large establishment, or if a smaller town, a single-room dressmaker shop. A dressmaker could live with her family or by herself, or not even have a shop, but instead traveling to and from her client's home and to stay and board with them until the dress was done. Or again, take projects from her clients and bring them home to work on. And of course, the price that was charged varied greatly based on where they were located, how fine and sought after the establishment or dressmaker herself was, etc. Price also depended on the service that the dressmaker performed. A dressmaker is employed to make dresses, of course, but there are varying levels of dressmaking that a client may require. Firstly, for more industrious or thrifty women, the dressmaker may only be employed to drape a pattern for the lady. This involves scrap fabric being draped across the client's front and back, and for the dressmaker, then marks and cuts where the seam lines go, and then creates a personalized pattern to each client. The client may then purchase this pattern to make up her own clothing at home. The Philosophy of Housekeeping by Joseph Bardwell Lineman, published in 1859, has this to say on dress patterns. For making the waist, that is the bodice, and sleeves, you must have patterns. Few have an eye so good as to cut this part of the dress without a guide. If you cannot procure patterns from a dressmaker, take a neatly fitting dress, and after pinning newspapers very carefully to all the seams in the front first and then those to the back, cut out yourself a pattern making due allowances for seams. End quote. In addition to not only procuring a pattern from a dressmaker, a woman who can perform very basic sewing but has not the skill for dressmaking itself may employ a dressmaker not only to make and fit the pattern, but also to make up the sleeves and the bodice while the lady herself sewed the skirt. As skirts in this particular era are usually straight rectangles that are just hemmed and then either pleated or gauged into the waistband, they are very simple to put together. They require but little skill, and a lady with very little sewing knowledge may still be able to put that together and save herself some money by not employing the dressmaker to make the entire gown. This is the method my best 1850s friend, Mrs. Carrie Williams, achieves her cashmere gown. I know that we have mentioned Carrie Williams in both myth-busting videos, but she wrote such good insights into wardrobes and sewing in her little diary. She says on Friday, December 10th, 1858, that, and I quote, "The first woman that made their appearance at the house this morning was Miss Gibson. Therefore my time has been taken up with that old but worthy ancient maiden lady in my cashmere dress, which she cut out today. I made the skirt." End quote. A bit later in the day, Carrie says, and I quote, "In conclusion, I cannot refrain from saying that I think Miss Gibby, as Walla calls her, is a real gossip. I was quite amused today at some of the yarns she spun about the widow Sweeney." End quote. The next day, Saturday, Carrie writes, quote, "Raining all day, Miss Gibson and I work steady on my dress. It is done and fits me beautiful. How glad I am that it is done and it becomes me so well." End quote. The next day, Sunday, Miss Gibson goes home after promising to come again the next day. So on Monday, Miss Gibson makes Carrie's mother-in-law, the elder Mrs. Williams, a delaine dress, and the elder Mrs. Williams is also sewing her own skirt by way of helping. Also, apparently Miss Gibson does not like mackerel. On Tuesday, Carrie writes that Miss Gibson has not finished Mrs. W's dress and helped her all day with little interruption. On Wednesday, Carrie writes, and I quote, "Miss Gibson went home about 1 o'clock. I paid her $8. The facing on my dress was not straight, therefore I ripped out the hem and she basted over again, so this afternoon I hemmed it down again and made the pocket. This forenoon she finished Mrs. W's dress." End quote. I am unsure whether the $8 was for both Carrie and Mrs. W's dress or just Carrie's. I do wonder if the payment was not just for both, as Carrie only paid Miss Gibson after both dresses were complete, and not just after completing her own dress. So that is one way a dressmaker could work, is going into the client's home, staying overnight, sleeping in the same house, eating their food, and making the dress during the day. And of course, another service that a dressmaker could provide would be to make up the whole dress. And even this comes with this whole array of options. Most typically, it seems that ladies would purchase their own dresses, and if you have not seen the second myth-busting video I did last month, that means she purchased a dress length of fabric within in-dress goods, not necessarily a finished dress. And typically they would also purchase the trim and then send the whole off to the dressmaker. If the dressmaker had a recent pattern for the lady, she makes it up. Otherwise, the lady will need to submit for a fitting. I have also seen preferences for women sending notes to their dressmakers to make up the usual pattern, but to add so much to the waist, or add a little link to the bodice instead of going to cut a whole new pattern. They would just tell the dressmakers what alterations they wanted to make. This is mentioned in 1863's Employments of Women that I mentioned before, and I quote, "Some dressmakers in New York have kept the patterns of ladies in the South and made dresses for years. If a slight change was needed, for instance, the length increased or the waist made smaller or vice versa, the lady wrote accordingly," end quote. Women could also buy their own fabric and then have the dressmaker purchase the trimmings, although this was warned against in some articles, as dressmakers would often add on a little bit to the price of the trimming to cover their time, and it was generally considered poor economy to not pick the trim yourself for this reason. Going back to Lydia and her silk dress, we read about dressmakers after Lydia has finally finished her uncle's shirts, received a whole $250, and went to the big city of Philadelphia to buy her silk, as the local store owner had just sold all of his silks. Also, the storekeeper's name is Mr. Yardley. Yardley. He sells yards of fabric. Again, Victorian stories and their fun names. Lydia goes to many shops to buy her silk, and she finally settles on one. It is a changeable, also known today as a shot silk, with lilac and green, and the wrong side of the fabric is green only. After showing Mrs. Pentland, who is the lady of the house that Lydia is staying at in Philadelphia, and being much praised for her good choice, she is sent to Mrs. Pentland's dressmaker, and I will read the story, quote, "The next thing is to make it up as soon as possible. I went this afternoon to Mrs. Pentland's dressmaker, but she has so much work already on hand that she could not undertake mine in less than 3 weeks. However, she recommended me to another fashionable dressmaker, Miss Trimmings. So I went from her to Miss Trimmings, who, keeping a greater number of assistants, consents to fit me tomorrow and finish the dress in 3 days. As she is very fashionable, I leave the style of making entirely up to her," end quote. The next entry reads as follows, quote, "I have been fitted for my dress. I ventured to caution Miss Trimmings against certain errors I was afraid she would commit, but she assured me that she thoroughly understood her business and that she worked for some of the first ladies of Philadelphia," end quote. Several days later, quote, "Oh, Margaret, Margaret, my silk dress is ruined. It came this afternoon accompanied by a receipted bill amounting to much more than I anticipated, but which, however, I paid immediately, as is the custom in our family. My heart misgave me as soon as I unfolded the dress. When I attempted to try it on after much dragging and squeezing, assisted by Mrs. Pentland and her maid Susan, I found to my utter consternation that it was way too small for me. No strength could draw together the hooks and eyes so as to make it meet up in the back, and across the chest it was disfiguringly narrow and killingly tight. The sleeves are entirely too short, so is the skirt, and no outlet has been left in any place whatsoever. All has been shaved or snipped and trimmed off so close to the seams, and none of the leavings or shapings have been sent home, so that there is no way of altering or enlarging it so as to make it wearable, and no matching it. Is there no law to punish a mantua maker for spoiling a dress? What shall I do is really too much to bear. The silk that I earned myself and sewed for with much diligence, that I had so much difficulty in choosing, my first silk dress that I ever had in my life," end quote. So what became of Lydia's silk dress? Well, after marrying and settled down, quote, "The mantua maker was forgiven. Our heroine carried the unfortunate silk dress with her when she returned to Hazelridge, and there presented it to a young friend whose figure was not too small," end quote. Why she did not go to the dressmaker and insist upon at least getting back the leavings and the extra fabric to enlarge the dress, I don't know, as this appears to me to be entirely the dressmaker's fault. But again, the want of a good dressmaker, they can be hard to find. Let us now discuss how much a dressmaker would expect to earn. How much of a living could be earned by a dressmaker? In general, the wage gap between men and women was much larger then than it is even now, and women did not hardly earn very much, but dressmakers was seen as a decent profession for women. Now women could employ themselves in making a variety of clothing for both men and women, but specifically those who were making dresses. Mrs. Penny, and again, her book, The Employments of Women, has this to say, quote, "While many of those at the head of dressmaking establishments are realizing dazzling profits, the poor seamstress working in busy times from 12 to 16 hours out of the 24 receives a generous allowance from $1.50 to $4.50 a week. But few, and those only of much skill, taste, and dexterity, ever gain better prices." End quote. For those apprenticing or even working underneath another dressmaker, they are often paid by the week as well. In the same book, Employments of Women, it is written that Mrs. C, a dressmaker in New York, pays, quote, "A girl of fair abilities can learn dressmaking in 6 months. The first 3 months she does not pay anything, but the last, $1 a week. After they have learned, she pays according to their taste, skill, and industry. One girl that has good taste in trimming and finishing off, she pays $4 a week. Another that sews well and is industrious but deficient in taste, she pays $2. They all live at home." End quote. Also in the same paragraph, quote, "A Miss H told me 3 years ago she earned $7 a week, 10 hours a day, sewing for a French lady on Broadway who had a great run of Southern custom," end quote, and that is Southern customers. To contrast this, the average wage of a female domestic servant in New York City was $1.25 a week, as documented in Statistics of the United States in 1860, and that does include the servant's board. This is less than the United States average of $1.85 a week for a female servant's board, with the highest paying states for female servants being Oregon at $5.40 a week and Louisiana at $3.36 a week. A male domestic servant would expect to earn $2.24 a week, including board in New York, contrasted with the women who are earning $1.25. These are very menial jobs, as even the average wage for a farmhand in New York was $13.19 a week. This is good information, because although we are not really talking about servant girls right now, the Employments of Women does have this gem, quote, "Servant girls seldom pay over $1 for making a dress, yet 10,000 servant girls in New York City will have from 3 to 6 and 8 new dresses a year," end quote. So with the average wage of a servant girl being $1.25 a week, a servant girl is paying just under a week's wages to have a dress made, and was spending at least 3 weeks' salary and up to 8 weeks' worth of salaries in dresses alone per year. And that's just dresses. It does not include shawls, gloves, aprons, shoes, bonnets, chemises, corsets, drawers, night dresses, etc. Anyway, I just think it adds perspective. Those who are working for themselves invoiced their clients directly and controlled how much they charged. Women who were not dressmakers by profession but took on dressmaking or seamstress work as a side hustle were also able to charge what they pleased. The New Peterson magazine in 1870 has a story entitled Laura's Mistake, which opens with Laura, a very poor woman living with her mother, making out a bill to a client. The bill is for a satin overskirt costing $5 to make, a paid out for the same, which I don't know quite what that means, but it's paid out for $2, and I would say if it's another satin overskirt, I don't know why the large price difference, so I'm really not entirely sure what that means. But perhaps the more expensive one just required more work or more trimming or something. Back to the bill, a ruffling skirt, which costs $5, and a belt with braided sash ends, $1. Laura mentions that of her client, specifically, quote, she carries her old habits of saving into her new life, for she knows I will not charge 1/2 the price of a regular dressmaker would. She would have to pay Madame Joliffe $25 at least, end quote. I did briefly mention about male dressmakers. And to quote 1863 Godey's Lady's book, "Can you believe that in the middle of the 19th century there exist dressmakers with beards? Men, real men like Zouaves, who with their strong hands measure the exact dimensions of the most titled women in Paris, dress them, undress them, and turn them around and round before them as if they were neither more or less than wax figures in a hairdresser's window," end quote. A particular Englishman working in Paris as a dressmaker is described in the same article, and his prices were, I quote, "For cutting a dress, $10, for dressing a lady, $15, for fitting her for a dinner, $20, and $25 for a party," end quote. Just to clarify, it is my current understanding that cutting a dress means the making of the pattern and fitting of the garment. So $10 for that, $15 for a day dress, $20 for a dinner dress, and $25 for an evening party or ball dress. But again, pay varied quite a bit depending on how many dressmakers were in the area, how esteemed or fashionable they were, how experienced the dressmaker was, or if she was professional or just doing it on the side, whether she worked for herself or as an apprentice or an assistant, etc. But hopefully those stories give you a slight idea of what it costs to have a dress made. So who is employing those dressmakers? Well, women for starters, as the vast majority of women in the 19th century to boot. I have mentioned it before, and I always get pushback from those who don't study the era because it really shatters the common worldview on how life was for poor people back then. But all dresses were custom made in the 19th century. There was no such thing as off-the-rack dresses. You could buy bonnets ready-made. You could buy shawls ready-made. Parasols, fans, gloves, mantles, and veils, you could all buy that ready-made. You cannot buy a dress ready-made. All dresses were custom made for someone. Even dresses that were bought secondhand were often refitted to the new owner. So unless you are skilled enough to do your own dressmaking, you are employing a dressmaker at least for the pattern making. Even in manuals on dressmaking written specifically to women who wish to save money by making up their own dresses do often state that it is best to procure a pattern from a dressmaker, or at the very least to pick apart an older well-fitting dress by which to make a pattern. So even then, a professional dressmaker has to be involved at some point. Beginning in the 1840s, there are published works on draping your own patterns. The Art of Dressmaking, containing plain directions and simple language from fitting the pattern to finishing of the dress, by Eliza Ann Corey in 1849, is a good one, and it is available for free on Google Books. And as we learned earlier, even servants working in New York City are employing dressmakers to make their dresses. So employing a dressmaker is not a class thing, or in fact, it kind of can be, considering that sometimes the very rich kept a dressmaker at their own house specifically to sew for them, and that is a luxury that not everyone can afford, because having a servant whose only job is to sew for you can be expensive. And yes, it was not uncommon for wealthy women in the southern part of the United States to have dressmakers in fancier cities such as Philadelphia, New York City, or even Paris. Actually, the lady I used to portray here in Texas, Sarah Gross Wharton, had her patterns taken for her in New Orleans, and those were sent directly to Paris, where the dressmakers in Paris would then make her dresses in the latest French style and send them back to Texas for her. It was really just all about money. If you're rich, you could afford the best dressmakers in the world, and if you were not, you may be stuck with the local Miss Trimmings, who may or may not have had formal training and may or may not know a thing about fitting and sewing. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research into 19th century dressmakers and their profession. I've had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. Next episode, we'll be looking more into Victorian dress myths, including the myth that they didn't have bright colors back then. So be on the lookout for that episode in the later weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you may email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or on YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me what topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next one.